Carl Jung discovered a secret about society that almost nobody talks about. A secret so uncomfortable that even today, psychologists rarely bring it up. The more conscious you become, the more unbearable ordinary society becomes. Jung did not call this weakness, nor did he see it as an illness. He called it the necessary withdrawal, a psychological law that few dare to acknowledge. Modern society does not want you to know this, because if the truth spread, millions would realize that the urge to disappear, to leave social media, to live on the margins, is not a sign of abnormality, but an inevitable stage of awakening. Jung himself encountered this secret after a profound spiritual crisis. During the years he confronted the unconscious and wrote The Red Book. Parties, meetings, and small talk became so suffocating he could hardly breathe. He realized, the more awake you are, the less you can endure the collective performance, where everyone wears a persona, pretending to be someone, while their true shadow is being projected outward. Look closely, and you'll see this image in your own daily life. How many times have you sat in a work meeting, everyone discussing goals, strategies, numbers, and suddenly you feel as though you're watching a stage play where each person repeats lines already scripted? It's not that you hate them. It's that a part of you knows what's happening isn't real. And once you realize this, exhaustion rises like a wave you cannot hold back. Jung called this the burden of seeing. Once you see the shadows the collective is hiding, its projections, its blame, its shared illusions, you cannot go back to pretending you don't see them. For most people, joining the collective feels natural, effortless. But for the awakened, every social interaction becomes a silent battle. How not to betray yourself. How not to extinguish the flame of consciousness that has just been lit. And here is the value you'll gain if you stay with this video. You'll understand why the urge to disappear is not a sign of weakness, but proof that your consciousness is entering a more mature stage. You'll see that Jung left behind a detailed map, from withdrawal to solitude, and finally to re-emergence with an entirely new role. And most importantly, you'll learn how to use this stage as a stepping stone to nurture awakening, rather than blame yourself or believe something is wrong. If you've ever felt you no longer belong to the crowd, if you've longed for silence without knowing why, stay, because what you're about to hear may change how you see yourself and the awakening journey you are walking. If the urge to disappear wasn't a flaw in you, but the first proof that you are awake, how differently would you see yourself? This is the question nearly every awakened person must face, yet society avoids it. When someone begins to withdraw, choosing silence over noise, solitude over company, the common reaction from others is worry or judgment. He has a problem. She's depressed. They can't adapt. But Carl Jung emphasized that such impulses are not necessarily pathological. They may be signs that consciousness has reached a threshold where the collective performance becomes unbearable. Look at the patients Jung once analyzed. One of them was a successful businessman who had spent his whole life building reputation and career. But when the analytic process uncovered the buried shadow, he could no longer endure boardroom meetings. He saw the lies, the pretense, the persona theater laid bare. What had once been his pride became torture. Society labeled him a failure. But in Jung's eyes, this was evolution. He had stepped off the stage and seen the play for what it was. We live in a culture that glorifies belonging. From childhood, we are taught that happiness means having friends, a social network, a place in the community. But if Jung is right, perhaps perfect belonging is the deepest form of sleep. And perhaps the feeling of loneliness, even the desire to disappear, is the very proof that awakening has begun. In modern life, this problem becomes even clearer. Social media makes us believe our worth depends on constant visibility, posting photos, updating statuses, joining debates. Anyone who remains silent too long is considered strange. Yet for those who have touched the self, every scroll through a newsfeed is a shock. Smiling faces, moral slogans, political theater, all of it like a hall of mirrors reflecting shadows no one wants to see. They cannot integrate anymore, because integration now means betraying themselves. Jung once wrote, "The more you integrate your own shadow, the more unbearable the collective shadow becomes." That is, when you've dared to face your own selfishness, anger, greed, you can no longer pretend not to see the same projections at the level of society. At that point, sitting quietly in a crowd, joining in small talk, becomes a painful act. The real problem is not that awakened people are disappearing. The problem is how society labels their disappearance. Instead of recognizing it as a stage of development, we call it failure, pathology, weakness. And because of this misunderstanding, many awakened individuals spiral into self-blame. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm broken. But in reality, they are one step ahead of the collective. A step that, sooner or later, society itself will have to face. The question is not how to drag them back, but what is it in the nature of society that makes it impossible for them to stay? Imagine a future where every conversation you enter feels hollow. Every community held together not by truth, but by shared illusions. In such a world, the more conscious you become, the more unbearable it is to stay. This is not some distant future. Carl Jung pointed out that society has always functioned through collective illusions, what he called the collective unconscious. It is not only a shared memory bank of humanity, but also the framework that keeps society intact. Within that framework, each person must play a role. Live inside shared stories. This nation is right, that group is wrong, these people are good, those people are evil. And the system only remains stable if everyone joins the game. Jung observed that when an individual begins individuation, the process of becoming their true self, conflict inevitably arises. They can no longer blindly believe in the illusions constructed by the collective. Remember Germany in the 1930s. Jung warned of a mass psychosis, a kind of collective madness. An entire nation was swept into nationalist fever, believing a single shared story, projecting all of its shadow onto the other. Anyone who dared not believe was cast out. That was the clearest illustration of how society sustains itself only when people accept collective blindness. We usually think the problem lies in the individual, that they are too sensitive, too weak, too isolated. But what if it's the other way around? What if society itself is the patient, and the awakened individual is simply the first to recognize the symptoms? What if your inability to fit in is not a flaw, but the sign that you've seen the curtain fall? Jung once analyzed a male intellectual who constantly attacked the hypocrisy of others. Eventually, he realized those were merely his own unacknowledged shadows. The problem is, this man was not unique. Society functions the same way. Rather than take responsibility, the collective casts blame onto outsiders. When an individual begins to recognize this game, they feel pushed to the margins, unable to join in the collective dance any longer. In the modern world, the collective unconscious hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed form. Polarized politics, social media full of outrage, the endless division of us versus them appears everywhere. In America, taking just one step offbeat in the collective dance, voicing an opinion outside the mainstream, is enough to be drowned in a wave of outrage. For those still asleep, this is just the game of power. But for the awakened, it feels like witnessing a collective psychosis. And this makes staying an unbearable burden. Jung wrote, "The greatest danger to mankind is not earthquakes or floods, but the inability of man to see his own shadow. Blindness to the shadow is the root." This is the deeper reason awakened people disappear. They have seen. And once you have seen, you cannot go back. You cannot join in the blame game when you know it is only shadow projection. You cannot chant slogans when you know they are only the collective's way of avoiding the mirror. So if society is truly sustained by illusion, the question is, what happens when an individual decides to stay and live authentically? Will they transform the collective or be crushed by it? We're told that those who withdraw from society are weak, antisocial, maybe even broken. But what if it's the other way around? What if the real sickness lies in the environments that demand constant performance, endless noise, and masks that never come off? Carl Jung observed that when a person begins to awaken, the problem is not only within their inner world, but also in the environment around them. It is the environment, family, workplace, social media, that becomes incapable of holding a consciousness that has touched the truth. Instead of welcoming awakening, society resists it like a body rejecting a foreign object. Look at social media. On the surface, it is a space for connection and sharing. But for the awakened, it is a massive persona machine. Every photo, every status update is carefully crafted to hide shadows and project a polished image. For those still asleep, this is normal. But for the awakened, every scroll feels like standing inside a storm of unconscious energy. Envy, anger, bragging, all swirling into the psyche. To stay is to be drained. To withdraw is to remain whole. Jung once told the story of a devoted schoolteacher who, after years of analysis, became so sensitive that she could no longer stand in front of a classroom. She didn't just hear her students' words. She felt their anxieties, their projections, the unconscious tension generated by the group. The result? She collapsed into chronic fatigue. Doctors told her she was not sick. Yet when she left teaching and moved to a quiet village, her health almost immediately returned. This proved that it wasn't she who was broken, but the environment that had become too toxic for an awakened consciousness. We are conditioned to blame the individual. He's too sensitive. She can't handle pressure. They're weak. But Jung showed the opposite. It is the environment that is pathological, because it demands constant pretense, persona worn from dawn till night. The awakened do not withdraw because they are broken. They withdraw because they refuse to live in falsehood any longer. Look at the workplace. A modern boardroom doesn't just demand competence, it demands performance. The model employee, the tough leader, the friendly colleague. For the unawakened, this is corporate culture. For the awakened, it is a prison of persona. They feel as though they must betray the self just to earn a paycheck. Each passing day becomes a wound. Eventually, the only choice left is to disappear. Even in families, the place that should feel safest, the awakened are seen as different. They begin to notice unconscious patterns handed down through generations, the impositions, the unfulfilled dreams of parents projected onto children. If they remain silent, they are called distant. If they speak up, they are labeled rebellious. In both cases, their very presence destabilizes the family script that has been preserved for generations. Jung realized a law. Every system protects itself. And society protects itself by labeling as abnormal those who no longer play by its rules. But if we look deeper, we see the reversal. It is the environment that is abnormal, while withdrawal is actually a sign of psychological health. So the question becomes, what happens if the awakened person ignores this truth and tries to remain inside those environments anyway? What if the greatest loss isn't leaving society, but staying and slowly losing yourself piece by piece? Jung once said, "When an individual has touched the truth within and is still forced to live among the unconscious collective, they no longer live. They merely exist. The price they pay is not only fatigue, but the gradual erosion of the very consciousness they worked so hard to awaken. This is the most dangerous kind of loss. Invisible at first, but eating away at you day by day." In his analytic sessions, Jung observed many awakened patients falling into cycles of vague illnesses. One schoolteacher he treated described feeling drained after every class. Not because of the workload, but because every gaze, every word in the classroom carried projections and unprocessed shadows. She wasn't just teaching, she was unconsciously carrying the collective's energy. Her body responded with chronic exhaustion. Society called it job stress. But Jung understood. It was consciousness struggling to survive in an environment too toxic. And the loss here was devastating. Health, passion, and ultimately faith in her own path. Society often sees staying as responsibility, as strength. But what if staying is the fastest way to lose yourself? What if resilience in the eyes of the collective is, in truth, the most subtle betrayal you could commit against your own soul? At the personal level, the cost is burnout, depression, exhaustion, disconnection from the self. Many of Jung's patients described the feeling of not being themselves anymore, as if every day spent inside the collective was another piece of themselves left behind. At the collective level, the cost is even greater. Society gradually loses its most lucid voices. They do not disappear out of selfishness, but because they can no longer participate. The result is a society echoing only the loud voices of persona, while the truths of the self fall silent. In modern life, this is clearest on social media. When an awakened person leaves Facebook or TikTok, society sees it as losing a member. But the real loss isn't in follower counts. It lies in the fact that the collective loses the chance to hear an authentic voice. And when thousands of awakened individuals choose silence, society becomes a chamber echoing only with voices that have never faced their own shadows. Jung called this psychological labor, the invisible work the awakened must do to survive among the unconscious, not reacting to projections, not being pulled into scripts, not allowing the collective's energy to infiltrate. This labor is unseen, yet it drains more than physical work. The loss is not only energy, but creativity, love of life, and sometimes even the will to exist. If all those capable of seeing the collective shadow fall silent or disappear, what becomes of society? It is like a ship that has lost its helmsman. The noise remains, the engines keep running, but the direction drifts steadily into darkness. That is the price the collective pays when it cannot hold space for the awakened. If withdrawal is necessary to avoid loss, then is it mere escape? Or is it, as Jung called it, the symbolic stage of evolution known as the Hermit archetype? Solitude is not the absence of people, it is the presence of the self. Carl Jung. At first, this statement may sound simple, yet it holds the entire key to what Jung called the Hermit Phase, the stage of the hermit in the process of individuation. Here, withdrawal is not a sign of depression, nor is it an escape. It is a necessary psychological step to preserve and renew consciousness. Jung lived this experience profoundly. After his confrontation with the unconscious, recorded in the Red Book, he could no longer endure ordinary social interactions. Every casual conversation felt like theater. Instead of forcing himself to fit in, he built the Bollingen Tower on the shores of Lake Zurich, a place almost entirely separate from society. To outsiders, it looked like strange isolation. But for Jung, it was a laboratory of the soul. There he painted, carved stone, wrote journals, and conversed with his own darkness. This withdrawal did not destroy him. It became the wellspring of creativity and wisdom that he later brought back to the world. One of Jung's case studies illustrates this clearly. A man, after years of analysis, found he could no longer remain in the corporate environment. Every meeting was simply persona speaking to persona, no one truly present. He decided to leave his career, retreating to a small village where he worked with his hands and read books. To society, this looked like failure. But years later, he returned with a renewed soul, creative, resilient, and quietly guiding those in spiritual crisis. His hermit phase was not collapse. It was the incubation of a new way of being. We often fear solitude, seeing it as a mark of failure. But Jung revealed the opposite. Solitude can be the soul's most courageous act. In solitude, you no longer have to play roles. In solitude, you are forced to face the shadow you usually avoid. And it is precisely this confrontation that opens the doorway to the self. In modern life, the hermit phase doesn't need to be a stone tower by a lake. It may mean deleting social media accounts, taking a break from work, moving somewhere quiet, or simply setting firm boundaries with your surroundings. The form doesn't matter. The purpose does. Withdrawing to preserve consciousness, so it is not consumed by the collective persona. Jung emphasized, the hermit phase is not an ending, it is preparation. Withdrawal is not to disappear forever, but to integrate, to form a self strong enough for return. And the return is never to blend back in as before. It is to appear in a new way, as an artist, a therapist, a teacher, or simply as an authentic individual who becomes a mirror for others. So if withdrawal is not weakness, but the soul's most courageous step, do we have the strength to enter our own hermit phase? When your body is suffocating, instinct forces you to search for air. When your soul is suffocating, instinct forces you to search for solitude. Jung believed that withdrawal was not an antisocial act, but the survival instinct of the soul. Just as the body compels you to breathe when deprived of oxygen, the psyche compels you to leave the crowd when the collective unconscious becomes too toxic. This is not a luxury, nor an eccentric preference. It is a natural defense mechanism to keep consciousness from being swallowed. Remember Jung's own journey. After his intense crisis in 1913, he could no longer function as a conventional scientist. He resigned from his professorship, retreated into a quiet life, confronting the unconscious, writing and painting in the Red Book. To many, it looked like collapse. But to Jung, it was survival. Had he not done so, he would have lost his true self. It was precisely through this Hermit Phase that he later produced his great concepts: archetype, shadow, self, collective unconscious. In a world that glorifies noise, we forget that silence is also an act of survival. The awakened do not withdraw from society because they hate people. They withdraw because staying means the slow death of the soul. They choose outer loss in order to preserve inner wholeness. Seen through the lens of survival, they are not weak. They are courageous. For they have chosen true life over false existence. Jung saw this pattern repeat again and again. One patient he called the young philosopher vanished from academic life after analysis. Rumors said he had failed. Yet 3 years later, he returned with profound insights and works that could never have emerged had he remained imprisoned in the persona of academia. His withdrawal was not failure. It was the survival of the soul, making space for a deeper self to be born. In modern life, this is clearer than ever. A person deleting their social media is not unable to handle technology, but recognizing that a feed saturated with personas has become toxic air. Someone leaving a job is not lazy, but refusing to betray the self day after day. These acts are not escape. They are oxygen for the soul. And here lies Jung's enduring philosophy. Solitude may be the only path to preserve the integrity of consciousness. Withdrawal is not the end, but the beginning of a deeper process. It allows the soul to regenerate, to restructure, to prepare for return. Not to blend back in as before, but to bring light to the collective from a different, more enduring place. If withdrawal is the soul's survival instinct, do we have the courage to trust it? Or will we choose to stay, only to watch ourselves slowly wither in silence? We think of disappearance as failure. But what if vanishing was the very step that made a greater return possible? This is the paradox Jung observed in many of his patients. Those who seemed to have vanished from society, appearing broken or defeated, often returned with an entirely new strength. For him, this was not failure, but unexpected success. A form of triumph only accessible to those courageous enough to withdraw. Jung once told the story of a young philosopher who, after years of analysis, suddenly left the academy, disappearing from intellectual life. Friends believed he had lost his mind, that his career was over. But 3 years later, he returned with blazing insights, utterly unlike the shallow philosophy he once produced. Withdrawal had not destroyed him. It had incubated him, allowing a deeper human being to be born. This is the pattern Jung called the journey of withdrawal, transformation, return. We often imagine success as staying, as persevering in the crowd. But Jung revealed that sometimes true success only comes when you dare to walk away. The awakened do not return to blend in as before. They return to bring gifts to those just beginning their own path of awakening. In modern life, we see this clearly. Some people leave social media only to return years later as profound creators instead of trend chasers. Others walk away from corporate careers, appearing to lose everything, yet later become therapists, mentors, or simply authentic individuals who inspire by example. To society, withdrawal looks like failure. But in the logic of the soul, it is preparation. And when they return, they become what Jung called border dwellers. Those who no longer belong to the unconscious center, but who stand at the edges, guiding others who dare to step out. Jung himself lived this pattern. After his solitary years at Bollingen, he did not return as a conventional psychiatrist, but as a sage, a creator of new knowledge. He no longer played in society's theater. Yet he wrote, he taught, he left behind a legacy for generations to come. His return was never for the masses, but for those ready to listen. And here lies the deeper meaning. The awakened never return to become part of the old society. They return as small lights, illuminating the way for those still stumbling in the dark. Their absence may first feel like a loss, but their return is a gift. So if withdrawal is not failure, but preparation for a deeper return, do you have the courage to trust that process instead of fearing it?